What if I told you that the voice in your head that judges every thought, restricts every desire, and fills you with guilt for being human, is not your conscience? What if that internal prosecutor that never rests, never forgives, never allows you to simply exist without moral evaluation, is nothing more than sophisticated programming designed to make you controllable? Tonight we're going to examine the most heretical proposition in human history, that morality, the entire edifice of right and wrong that billions of people organize their lives around, is not a divine gift, not a natural law, not even a useful social contract. It is the most successful mind virus ever created, so perfectly designed that its victims defend it more passionately than their own freedom. For thousands of years, human beings have tortured themselves with moral codes. They've sacrificed their happiness on altars of righteousness. They've suppressed their nature for approval from imaginary judges. They've lived lives of voluntary limitation while calling it virtue. They've died for moral causes that served everyone's interests except their own. But what if morality is simply the most elegant form of slavery ever devised? A system so subtle that the enslaved never realize they're in chains, so complete that they forge their own shackles, so effective that they thank their masters for the privilege of servitude. Over the next hour, we will journey beyond the comfortable lies of ethical philosophy into the uncomfortable truth of human manipulation. We will examine how moral systems actually function, who benefits from their existence, and why they persist despite creating more suffering than joy, more limitation than liberation, more self-hatred than self-love. This exploration will violate every sacred assumption you hold about good and evil. You may discover that your deepest beliefs about right and wrong are elaborate justifications for your own imprisonment. You may realize that the moral principles you've used to judge others are the very chains that have kept you from becoming who you truly are. By the end of this journey, you will face a choice that few humans ever confront. Will you continue living within the moral matrix that has defined your existence, or will you step outside of good and evil into something far more dangerous, authentic freedom? Every moral system in human history, no matter how different it appears on the surface, serves the same fundamental function. It makes those without power accept their powerlessness by convincing them that their powerlessness is actually moral superiority. The ruled learn to feel virtuous about being ruled, the poor learn to feel noble about poverty, and the weak learn to feel righteous about weakness. Consider Christianity's rise in the Roman Empire. The early Christian message wasn't a universal truth about goodness. It was a perfectly designed psychological pacifier for people who had no power in the existing social order. Blessed are the meek didn't mean meekness was objectively good. It meant that meekness was the only option available to the powerless, so they needed a belief system that made meekness feel virtuous. The meek shall inherit the earth was perhaps the most brilliant piece of propaganda ever created. It promised the powerless that their powerlessness would eventually be rewarded, while ensuring they remained powerless in the present. They would get their reward later, in another life, in a different realm, but conveniently never in ways that actually challenged the existing power structure. Meanwhile, those same Roman elites who eventually adopted Christianity continued to exercise power, accumulate wealth, and shape the world according to their interests. They simply learned to frame their power in Christian language. They ruled by divine right rather than brute force. They accumulated wealth as God's stewards rather than personal ambition. They maintained all their advantages while appearing to embrace the same moral system as their subjects. This pattern repeated throughout history with mechanical precision. Medieval feudalism convinced peasants that their servitude was part of God's natural order. The nobility weren't exploiting them, they were protecting them as part of a divine hierarchy where everyone had their proper place. The serfs weren't being oppressed, they were fulfilling their moral duty in a cosmic system that served everyone's ultimate good. The caste system in India created perhaps the most sophisticated moral justification for hierarchy ever devised. Your social position wasn't random or unjust. It was the exact result you had earned through behavior in previous lives. If you were born into poverty and servitude, it was because your soul needed that experience for growth. If you were born into wealth and power, It was because you had spiritually earned those privileges. This moral framework made challenging social inequality seem not just futile, but spiritually harmful. Accepting your assigned position wasn't submission, it was wisdom. Remaining in your designated role wasn't oppression, it was cosmic justice. The system that benefited those born into power was moralized as serving everyone's spiritual development. Modern democratic societies have created even more subtle versions of this same dynamic. The moral system of meritocracy suggests that economic inequality reflects differences in virtue, effort, and contribution. Those who are wealthy deserve their wealth because they worked harder or provided more value. Those who are poor deserve their poverty because they made bad choices or didn't try hard enough. This moral framework allows those with economic power to feel they've earned their advantages, while making those without economic power feel responsible for their disadvantages. The wealthy can enjoy their wealth without guilt because they've earned it. The poor can accept their poverty without resentment because they deserve it based on their moral failings. But examine how wealth actually functions in modern society, and you discover that it has very little to do with moral virtue. Wealth correlates with inheritance, social connections, risk tolerance, and understanding of financial systems, none of which are moral qualities. Yet the moral framework of meritocracy disguises these practical realities as moral outcomes. The environmental movement has created one of the most successful modern moral systems by making every personal choice a moral issue with global consequences. What you eat, how you travel, where you live, what you buy, every decision becomes a moral test of your concern for the planet and future generations. This environmental morality serves several functions that have nothing to do with actual environmental protection. It allows people to feel virtuous through consumer choices rather than developing actual capabilities for environmental improvement. It transfers responsibility for systemic environmental problems from institutions to individuals. It creates new markets for moral products while leaving fundamental systems unchanged. Most importantly, it keeps people focused on judging their own and others' lifestyle choices rather than examining the larger systems that create environmental problems. The person who feels guilty about their carbon footprint isn't asking why energy systems haven't been redesigned to be cleaner. They're focused on personal moral performance rather than systemic change. Throughout all these historical examples, the same pattern emerges. Moral systems don't actually create the conditions they claim to promote. Christian societies weren't more loving than pagan ones. Feudal societies weren't more just than other hierarchical systems. Democratic societies aren't more equal than other political arrangements. Environmental moral systems haven't stopped environmental destruction. What these moral systems do create is psychological compliance with existing power arrangements. They make people feel good about accepting situations that don't serve their interests. They transform practical powerlessness into spiritual superiority. They convert economic disadvantage into moral advantage. The most telling aspect of this historical pattern is how those who benefit from moral systems rarely follow them themselves. Religious leaders accumulate wealth while preaching poverty. Political leaders consolidate power while advocating equality. Environmental advocates consume resources while promoting conservation. This isn't hypocrisy in the conventional sense. It's the natural result of understanding that moral systems are tools rather than truths. Those who create and promote moral systems understand their function, to make others voluntarily limit themselves while leaving those who understand the game free to operate according to practical rather than moral considerations. Modern neuroscience has revealed something that moral philosophers have never acknowledged. Moral thinking activates the same brain regions as drug addiction. The feelings of righteousness, moral superiority, and ethical clarity produce neurochemical rewards so powerful that they can become more compelling than food, sex, or survival itself. When you successfully follow a moral rule, resist a temptation, or judge someone else's behavior as immoral, your brain releases dopamine, serotonin, and other pleasure chemicals. This neurochemical reward makes moral behavior literally addictive in the same way that gambling, substances, or any other pleasurable activity can become compulsive. But unlike other addictions, moral addiction is socially encouraged and personally celebrated. The person who becomes addicted to moral righteousness doesn't recognize their addiction as pathological. They experience it as spiritual evolution. They don't see their compulsive moral judgment as destructive. They view it as ethical responsibility. This creates what researchers call moral addiction syndrome, a condition where people become so psychologically dependent on moral feelings that they organize their entire lives around generating and maintaining these feelings. They choose relationships, careers, and activities based not on what serves their authentic development, but on what provides opportunities for moral satisfaction. The moral addict needs constant supplies of moral validation to maintain psychological stability. They seek out moral causes to support, moral positions to defend, and moral judgments to make. When deprived of opportunities for moral expression, they often experience anxiety, depression, and identity crisis similar to withdrawal from chemical substances. This neurochemical dependency explains why moral people often seem more concerned with appearing virtuous than achieving practical results. The environmental activist who drives a hybrid car while consuming more resources than most people in history isn't trying to protect the environment. They're trying to maintain their supply of moral satisfaction. The social justice advocate who shares articles about inequality while taking no meaningful action isn't fighting injustice. They're feeding their addiction to moral righteousness. Brain imaging studies reveal that when people engage in moral reasoning, the logical centers of their brains become less active, while the emotional and reward centers become hyperactive. This means that moral thinking actually impairs rational analysis while enhancing pleasurable feelings. The more moral someone becomes, the less capable they become of objective analysis of their own behavior and its consequences. This neurological pattern explains why moral discussions rarely involve genuine reasoning and almost always devolve into emotional reactions. When you challenge someone's moral beliefs, you're not just disagreeing with their ideas, you're threatening their source of neurochemical pleasure. They respond not with logic, but with the desperate emotional intensity of someone whose drug supply is being threatened. The moral addiction also creates tolerance effects similar to chemical dependencies. The person who gets psychological rewards from moral superiority needs increasingly dramatic displays of virtue to achieve the same satisfaction. The individual who derives pleasure from judging others requires ever more extreme moral positions to maintain their sense of righteousness. This explains why moral movements tend to become more extreme over time rather than more moderate. The participants aren't becoming more virtuous. They're requiring stronger moral doses to achieve the same neurochemical high. What started as reasonable ethical positions evolve into moral fanaticism driven by addiction rather than principle. The withdrawal effects of moral addiction help explain why people become so hostile when their moral frameworks are challenged. When moral people are prevented from expressing their morality, when they can't signal virtue, follow moral rules, or judge others, they often experience genuine psychological distress. Their brain chemistry has adapted to regular doses of moral satisfaction, and deprivation creates real suffering. This is why moral people often become so aggressive toward those who live without moral frameworks. The person living freely without moral constraints isn't just making different choices, they're demonstrating that the moral addict's suffering is unnecessary, that their limitations are self-imposed, that their psychological dependency serves no higher purpose. The neuroscience also reveals why moral systems are so effective at controlling behavior. They don't rely on external punishment, which creates resistance, or external rewards, which are expensive to maintain. Instead, they hijack the brain's natural reward systems to create internal punishment and reward cycles that operate automatically. When you violate a moral rule, your brain doesn't just process the violation intellectually, it generates genuine neurochemical punishment in the form of guilt, shame, and anxiety. When you follow moral rules, your brain doesn't just acknowledge compliance, It produces genuine neurochemical rewards in the form of pleasure, satisfaction, and pride. This internal reward and punishment system means that moral control operates 24 hours a day without requiring any external supervision. You carry your own reward and punishment mechanisms wherever you go, automatically activated by thoughts, desires, and actions that conform to or violate your programmed moral code. The most sophisticated aspect of this neurochemical control is how it makes people complicit in their own manipulation. You don't experience moral restrictions as externally imposed limitations. You experience them as your own values generating your own feelings. You become addicted to the very mechanisms that control you, grateful for the prison bars that you experience as support structures. Breaking free from moral addiction requires recognizing it as addiction rather than virtue, understanding its neurochemical basis rather than its philosophical justifications, and developing alternative sources of meaning and satisfaction that don't depend on moral performance. But for most people, the neurochemical rewards of moral addiction feel so good that they never question whether those rewards serve their actual well-being or authentic development. What would human life look like if people stopped organizing their existence around moral categories? What would you become if you abandoned the internal prosecutor that judges every thought, restricts every desire, and limits every possibility? The answer isn't chaos, cruelty, or meaninglessness. It's something far more interesting and potentially more beautiful than moral people can imagine. Life beyond moral illusion begins with what philosophers call moral nihilism, not the popular misconception of nihilism as depression or destruction, but the recognition that moral categories are human inventions rather than universal truths. Good and evil, right and wrong, virtue and vice, these are not features of reality, but interpretive frameworks that humans impose on reality. Once you recognize moral categories as invented rather than discovered, you become free to evaluate actions, choices, and outcomes based on their actual consequences rather than their conformity to abstract moral rules. Instead of asking, "Is this good or evil?" you ask, "Does this serve my authentic development and well-being?" Instead of, "Is this right or wrong?" you ask, "Does this create the outcomes I actually want?" This shift from moral evaluation to practical evaluation transforms every aspect of decision-making. Career choices are no longer about what's meaningful in moral terms, but about what engages your deepest capabilities and interests. Relationship decisions aren't about moral obligations, but about genuine attraction, compatibility, and mutual enhancement. Personal choices aren't about virtue signaling, but about authentic self-expression and practical effectiveness. The person living beyond moral illusion doesn't become selfish in the petty sense. They become strategically self-interested in ways that often serve others better than moral selflessness ever could. When you pursue excellence in areas you genuinely care about, when you develop your capabilities to their fullest potential, when you create value according to your authentic vision, you contribute more to the world than if you spent that same energy trying to be morally good. Consider the entrepreneur who builds a successful business out of purely selfish motivations. They want financial freedom, creative expression, and the satisfaction of proving their ideas work. To achieve these goals, they must create products or services that others genuinely want, employ people and provide them with valuable work experience, and solve problems that improve others' lives. Their selfishness forces them to serve others effectively, because their success depends on others benefiting from what they create. Compare this to the morally motivated person who volunteers at various charitable organizations, always trying to help others, but never developing exceptional capabilities in any area. Their good intentions may make them feel virtuous, but their impact remains limited because they've never focused intensely enough on any single area to develop genuine expertise. The amoral entrepreneur might create thousands of jobs, serve millions of customers, and generate billions of dollars in economic value. The moral volunteer might directly help dozens of people, but never develop the focused excellence that creates systematic, scalable solutions to important problems. This pattern repeats across every domain of human achievement. The artist who pursues their own vision with obsessive dedication often creates works that move and inspire others more powerfully than the artist who tries to create what they think will help or educate people. The scientist who follows their curiosity about how the world works makes discoveries that advance human knowledge more effectively than the scientist motivated primarily by wanting to help humanity. Life beyond moral illusion also means freedom from the psychological suffering that moral frameworks create. Without moral categories, you don't experience guilt for having natural human desires. You don't feel shame for pursuing your authentic interests. You don't judge yourself for being human, rather than being the impossible moral ideal that was programmed into your consciousness. This doesn't mean becoming indifferent to the consequences of your actions or unconcerned with others' well-being. It means evaluating those consequences and that well-being based on actual outcomes rather than moral theories. You care about others when caring serves authentic relationship and genuine affection rather than moral obligation. You consider consequences when they affect your long-term interests and the interests of people you genuinely value. The person living beyond moral illusion develops what Nietzsche called amor fati, love of fate, or the ability to embrace everything that has happened to them as necessary for becoming who they are. Instead of judging their past according to moral categories, they integrate their entire experience as the raw material for their unique development. This integration includes embracing qualities that moral systems label negative. Your capacity for anger becomes energy for necessary confrontation. Your selfishness becomes the foundation for healthy self-respect and boundary maintenance. Your pride becomes motivation for achievement and excellence. Your sexuality becomes creative life force rather than something to be suppressed or moralized. Without moral categories imposing artificial splits in your psyche, you become psychologically whole in ways that moral people never achieve. You don't have to hide aspects of your nature or pretend to be someone you're not. You can acknowledge your complete humanity without shame, while choosing how to express different aspects of your nature based on practical wisdom rather than moral rules. This psychological integration creates what Jung called individuation, becoming who you actually are rather than who others expect you to be. But unlike Jung's moral approach to individuation, living beyond moral illusion means individuation guided by practical effectiveness and authentic satisfaction rather than ethical principles. Perhaps most importantly, life beyond moral illusion means freedom to create your own meaning and purpose, rather than accepting meaning systems created by others for their own purposes. You determine what makes your life worth living based on your actual experience of satisfaction and fulfillment, rather than moral theories about what should make life meaningful. This self-created meaning is often more compelling and sustainable than morally imposed meaning, because it emerges from your authentic nature rather than external expectations. The person who has discovered what genuinely matters to them based on their own experience is typically more motivated and fulfilled than the person trying to find meaning through moral frameworks that may have nothing to do with their actual interests and capabilities. Understanding morality as illusion is only valuable if it leads to different choices and better outcomes in your actual life. The transition from moral living to practical living requires specific changes in how you approach every major area of human experience, and these changes often feel uncomfortable initially because they violate everything you've been taught about being a good person. In relationships, living beyond moral illusion means choosing people based on genuine attraction, compatibility, and mutual benefit, rather than moral obligation, social expectations, or the desire to help someone who needs you. You maintain relationships that actually enhance your life and capabilities while ending relationships that drain your energy or limit your potential. This approach often results in smaller social circles but dramatically higher quality connections. Instead of trying to be friends with everyone or maintain relationships out of guilt and habit, you focus your limited social energy on people who genuinely add value to your life and whose company you actually enjoy. The person living beyond moral illusion doesn't feel guilty about being selective in relationships because they understand that their time and emotional energy are finite resources that should be invested wisely. They're not trying to be universally liked or morally perfect. They're trying to create a social environment that supports their authentic development and genuine happiness. In romantic relationships, this means choosing partners who actually attract you, rather than partners you think you should be attracted to based on moral considerations. It means being honest about your desires and boundaries, rather than trying to be the selfless, accommodating partner that moral frameworks promote. It means building relationships based on mutual satisfaction rather than mutual sacrifice. Paradoxically, this approach often creates more satisfying relationships for everyone involved because both people are getting what they actually want rather than what they think they should want. The relationship becomes based on genuine preference rather than moral performance. In career and financial matters, living beyond moral illusion means pursuing work that engages your deepest capabilities and interests, rather than work that seems meaningful in moral terms. It means building wealth and financial independence as practical necessities for freedom, rather than feeling guilty about wanting financial security. The person beyond moral illusion understands that being financially weak helps no one. When you're struggling economically, you can't help others effectively, you're vulnerable to exploitation, and you're dependent on others' generosity or institutional support. When you're financially strong, you can choose how to use your resources based on your actual values, rather than being forced into choices by economic necessity. This often requires saying no to family members who expect financial support, declining charitable giving until your own situation is secure, and choosing investments and career moves based on practical returns, rather than moral considerations about what kinds of work are good or meaningful. In personal development, the practical approach means investing in capabilities that will actually improve your life, rather than trying to become a morally better person. Instead of working on being more humble, kind, or selfless, you work on becoming more competent, confident, and effective at achieving your authentic goals. This might mean developing social skills if you want better relationships, building business capabilities if you want financial independence, improving your physical condition if you want health and attractiveness, or developing creative abilities if you want artistic expression. The focus shifts from moral improvement to practical capability development. The person beyond moral illusion doesn't feel guilty about wanting to become more attractive, successful, influential, or capable because they understand these are practical advantages that improve life outcomes. They don't apologize for wanting what they want or justify their goals according to moral frameworks. In dealing with conflict and difficult people, the practical approach means focusing on what actually works, rather than what's morally right. Sometimes this means avoiding conflict when confrontation would be costly and ineffective. Sometimes it means engaging in conflict when avoiding it would allow problems to escalate. Sometimes it means being diplomatically deceptive when honesty would create unnecessary problems. The key is evaluating strategies based on their practical effectiveness in achieving your actual goals, rather than their conformity to moral rules about how conflict should be handled. The person beyond moral illusion becomes skilled at reading situations and people, choosing responses that actually solve problems rather than responses that make them feel morally superior. This practical approach to human relations often produces better outcomes for everyone involved, because it focuses on results rather than principles. When your goal is to actually resolve a conflict rather than to be morally right about the conflict, you're more likely to find solutions that work for everyone. In health and physical well-being, living beyond moral illusion means taking care of your body because it improves your life quality and capabilities, rather than because it's morally good to be healthy. It means pursuing physical attractiveness because it creates practical advantages rather than feeling guilty about caring about appearance. The person beyond moral illusion understands that their body is the vehicle through which they experience everything else they want in life. Maintaining it in excellent condition isn't vanity. It's practical necessity for sustained high performance and life enjoyment. Perhaps most importantly, living beyond moral illusion means developing comfort with other people's disapproval and moral judgment. When you stop trying to be morally good, some people will criticize you as selfish, cruel, or uncaring. When you start prioritizing your authentic development, some people will accuse you of becoming arrogant or losing your values. These reactions are actually evidence that your approach is working. The people who benefited from your moral compliance will naturally resist changes that make you less available to serve their needs. Their moral criticism reveals that they were using moral language to control your behavior for their benefit. Understanding this dynamic allows you to evaluate criticism based on its source and motivation rather than its moral language. Criticism from people whose lives you admire and whose judgment you respect is worth considering. Criticism from people who have failed to create lives you would want is simply noise that can be ignored. We have reached the end of our journey through the greatest illusion ever invented, and you now face the most important choice of your existence. You can return to the comfortable prison of moral certainty, where every decision is guided by external rules and every action is evaluated according to standards you never chose. Or you can step into the terrifying and exhilarating freedom of creating your own meaning, values, and purpose based on your authentic nature and actual experience. This choice cannot be postponed or avoided. Every day, you continue to live according to moral frameworks that don't serve your genuine development. Is a day you remain imprisoned by other people's agendas disguised as universal truths. Every moment you spend feeling guilty for being human is a moment stolen from discovering what you're actually capable of becoming. The person who chooses freedom beyond moral illusion doesn't become a monster. They become authentic. They don't abandon all consideration for others. They develop genuine care based on real affection rather than moral obligation. They don't become destructive. They become creative according to their own vision rather than society's expectations. Most importantly, they become powerful in ways that moral people never achieve because their power comes from capability rather than compliance, from authentic self-development rather than external validation, from practical effectiveness rather than moral performance. This power is not power over others in the sense of domination or control. It's power over your own circumstances, power to create the life you actually want, rather than the life others expect you to live, power to express your genuine nature, rather than performing the character that moral systems have written for you. The morally programmed person will find this vision terrifying because they've been taught that humans are fundamentally bad and need moral constraints to prevent them from causing harm. But examine your actual experience. When you've acted according to your genuine nature rather than moral rules, when you've pursued what you authentically wanted rather than what you thought you should want, when you've been honest about your real feelings rather than performing moral emotions, did these moments make you more destructive or more creative, more selfish in petty ways, or more generous in meaningful ways, more harmful to others, or more capable of contributing something valuable? The fear of your authentic nature that moral systems have installed is itself the greatest harm those systems cause. They make you afraid of the very qualities and desires that might lead to your greatest achievements and most profound contributions to human flourishing. Your authentic nature is not evil waiting to be unleashed. It's creative potential waiting to be expressed. Your genuine desires are not selfish impulses to be suppressed. They're guidance systems pointing toward what would actually fulfill you. Your natural instincts are not destructive forces to be controlled. They're evolutionary wisdom that has kept humans alive and thriving for millennia. The person who embraces their authentic nature discovers something that moral people never learn, that self-interest and service to others are not opposites, but allies. When you become exceptionally good at what you genuinely love, when you develop your capabilities to their fullest potential, when you create according to your authentic vision, you produce value that benefits others more effectively than any amount of moral self-sacrifice ever could. The entrepreneur pursuing profit creates jobs and serves customers. The artist expressing their vision creates beauty that enriches others' lives. The scientist following curiosity makes discoveries that advance human knowledge. The individual developing their capabilities to the fullest becomes someone others can learn from, be inspired by, and genuinely benefit from knowing. This is why the greatest contributors to human civilization have typically been people who violated the moral conventions of their time. They were not trying to be morally good. They were trying to be authentically excellent. Their selfish pursuit of their own vision, their refusal to conform to moral expectations, their willingness to pursue their authentic interests despite social disapproval, these moral failures produced the art, science, philosophy, and innovations that have elevated human existence. The choice before you is simple, but not easy. You can continue living within the moral matrix, feeling virtuous about your limitations, while wondering why life never quite delivers the satisfaction it promises. You can keep following rules created by others for their purposes, while your authentic potential remains forever unexpressed. Or you can recognize morality for what it actually is, the greatest illusion ever invented, a sophisticated system of psychological control that has kept you from discovering who you really are and what you're actually capable of becoming. The moment you step beyond moral illusion, everything changes. Your relationships become authentic rather than performed. Your work becomes expression rather than obligation. Your choices become yours rather than society's. Your life becomes an adventure in self-creation rather than a performance in social conformity. You discover that the voice you thought was your conscience is actually your conditioning. The guilt you thought was spiritual guidance is actually psychological programming. The moral certainty you thought was wisdom is actually the absence of critical thinking about the systems that shaped your beliefs. Most remarkably, you discover that the freedom beyond moral illusion doesn't make you less caring about others. It makes your care authentic rather than dutiful. It doesn't make you less connected to meaning. It makes your meaning self-created rather than inherited. It doesn't make you less human. It makes you more fully human than moral systems ever allowed you to be. The greatest illusion ever invented was that you need moral systems to be good, that external rules make you virtuous, that other people's standards define your worth. The greatest truth ever discovered is that your authentic nature, fully expressed and wisely developed, is not only good enough, it's the source of everything genuinely valuable you can contribute to existence. The choice is yours, but choose quickly, because every day spent in moral prison is a day stolen from authentic life. To understand morality as illusion, we must first examine how moral programming actually operates in the human mind. Unlike physical chains that you can see and feel, moral chains are invisible, woven directly into your thought patterns, emotional responses, and self-concept from earliest childhood. The installation process begins before you can even speak. Watch a parent interact with a toddler, and you'll witness moral programming in real time. Good boy for sharing. Bad girl for hitting. We don't do that in our family. What will people think? These seemingly innocent phrases are actually installing an internal monitoring system that will operate for the rest of that child's life. By the time you reach adulthood, this system has become so sophisticated that you experience it as your own voice. You don't feel controlled by external authorities. You feel guided by your own principles. You don't recognize your limitations as imposed. You experience them as chosen. You've become your own prison guard, judge, and executioner, all while believing you're free. Consider how this internal moral system operates. Right now, as you listen to these words, part of your mind is evaluating whether these ideas are good or bad, right or wrong, helpful or harmful. You're not just processing information, you're subjecting every concept to moral judgment according to criteria you never consciously chose. This moral evaluation system doesn't ask whether an idea is true or false, useful or useless, accurate or inaccurate. It asks whether the idea conforms to moral categories that were installed by parents, teachers, religious authorities, and social institutions that had their own agendas for shaping your behavior. The genius of moral programming is that it operates automatically, below conscious awareness. You don't decide to feel guilty when you violate a moral rule. The guilt appears automatically. You don't choose to feel righteous when you follow moral principles. The righteousness manifests spontaneously. The system has hijacked your emotional responses to enforce compliance with standards you never agreed to accept. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of moral programming is how it shapes your very identity. You don't just follow moral rules. You become a good person or a bad person based on your compliance with those rules. Your worth as a human being becomes tied to your moral performance rather than your actual capabilities, achievements, or authentic self-expression. This identity fusion makes questioning moral systems feel like questioning your own worth. When someone challenges the moral framework that defines your goodness, they're not just disagreeing with your beliefs, they're attacking the foundation of your self-respect. This is why moral discussions often become so emotionally charged that rational discourse becomes impossible. The moral system also creates what psychologists call learned helplessness around moral questions. You're taught that moral truths are discovered by authorities, religious leaders, philosophers, social movements, rather than determined by your own judgment and experience. You learn to look outside yourself for moral guidance instead of developing internal wisdom about what actually serves your well-being and authentic development. This external moral dependency keeps you perpetually seeking approval from others rather than developing self-respect based on your own accomplishments and character development. You become addicted to moral validation from authorities who may have no understanding of your unique circumstances, goals, or nature. The programming also includes sophisticated defense mechanisms that protect the moral system from questioning. When you encounter evidence that contradicts your moral beliefs, successful people who are happy despite being selfish, kind people who are taken advantage of, moral people who suffer while immoral people prosper, your mind automatically activates defenses to preserve the moral framework. These defenses include rationalization, projection, attributing your own suppressed desires to others, and denial, simply refusing to acknowledge contradictory evidence. These mechanisms allow you to maintain moral beliefs even when your direct experience suggests those beliefs are inaccurate or harmful. Perhaps most tellingly, the moral system makes you afraid of your own nature. Your spontaneous desires are labeled selfish. Your natural competitive instincts are called cruel. Your authentic preferences are deemed shallow. Your genuine emotions are judged inappropriate. You learn to fear and suppress the very impulses that might lead to authentic self-expression and genuine happiness. This fear of your own nature creates a split between who you are and who you think you should be. You spend enormous energy trying to be the person your moral programming approves of, rather than discovering and developing who you actually are. You become an actor performing a role, rather than a human being living authentically. The result is a form of psychological self-imprisonment so complete that most people never even recognize it as imprisonment. They experience their moral limitations as their own values, their programmed responses as their authentic feelings, their externally imposed restrictions as their chosen principles.